Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenny Gesley. I'm a foreign law specialist at the Law Library of Congress, and I'm also the co-chair of ASIL's International Legal Research Interest Group. And on behalf of myself and my co-chair, Alex Zhang, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on global animal law research. I would just like to point out that we'll try to reserve some time at the end for Q&A, and you can submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your page, Zoom screen. So animal welfare, animal protection, and animal rights issues, they're not limited to the nation state. They're global issues which require a global solution. However, most of the time, the issues today are only addressed at a national level. So we have this mismatch here. Global animal law is an emerging area of law, which consists of local, national, regional, and international norms. And it also acknowledges that animal law is a cross-cutting issue that implicates many areas of law. But due to the novelty of the problem, research can sometimes be challenging. But we hope that today's webinar will help with that. I recently came across a case that you might be familiar with. It's the case of the so-called murderous Mary, who was a circus elephant that was hanged by the neck from a railcar-mounted industrial crane for killing a trainer in Tennessee in 1916. And her gruesome death has been captured in photographs that are available online if you care to Google it. But I think if this case had happened today, Mary the elephant, with the help of an animal rights organization, might have retained a lawyer and actually sued the circus for animal abuse, which is a so-called animal standing. Suing on behalf of animal plaintiffs has emerged as a novel way to enforce animal rights in many jurisdictions, including the United States. Well, other countries have gone the other way. As an example, Switzerland, for example, in the canton of Zurich, used to have an attorney for animal protection in criminal matters, who had standing to sue on behalf of animals during criminal cases in which animals were judged to be a victim. However, this position got abolished in 2010. Despite that, Switzerland, for example, has some of the strictest and most detailed animal protection laws in the world. Now, let me introduce you to our excellent speakers for today's webinar, who will address some of the issues that I just mentioned. Our first speaker is Jean Wenger, who will talk about companion animals in a global context. Jean is the director of the Law Library and senior lecturer at the Chicago-Kent College of Law Library in Chicago. After her, we will hear from Susan Gaultiere, who will address the very timely topic of animals in armed conflict. Susan is a reference and FCIL librarian at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School's Biddle Law Library. Our third speaker, Tariq Ahmad, will focus on researching animal law in India. He's a foreign law specialist at the Law Library of Congress, where he produces legal research reports for Congress, executive branch agencies, the federal judiciary, and the general public on mostly South Asian jurisdictions. And last but not least, we have Shay Elbaum, who will give an overview of marine mammal protection in the United States. Shay is the faculty research librarian at the University of Michigan Law Library. Okay, so let's get started. And Jean, over to you.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you to ASIL for hosting the webinar this afternoon. In 2019, when I saw a request for a book chapter on researching animal law, I didn't have to look far for inspiration. I was visiting family in California, and I was playing with Tex and Ruka, who have always been considered members of the family. And I wondered, what laws apply to these loving creatures? Domestic animals are part of our lives and family. We see them in stores, on public transportation, and this isn't only in the US. Historically, we've labeled such animals as pets, but a term that I was seeing more frequently was companion animal, and that's becoming a preferred term. But does this term have specific legal meaning? Are there any special rights or laws associated with this label? Animal law is a broad topic, so I decided to focus my research on those animals with the closest physical proximity to an emotional relationship with humans. And as terminology is critical in legal research, my initial challenge was figuring out what is a companion animal and are there other terms associated with it? Other terms I found were therapy, comfort, emotional support, and they were somewhat distinguishable from a companion animal. However, one significant distinction in terminology centered around those animals that were specifically trained to assist a human with a particular task. In the US, we refer to them as service. In other countries, I saw the terms assistance or guide. In the term companion animal is not a separate category under the umbrella of animal law. Rather, it falls under the heading of animal welfare and domestic animals. And actually, these headings proved useful in research. So when I started my research, I threw a wide net because I had no idea what I would find. And I started looking for journal articles. Particularly, I used the Law Journal Library, Academic Search Complete, Google Scholar, SSRN. And library catalogs, I would do keyword searches for books or articles, as well as using those headings of animal welfare and domestic animals. And early in my research, a recurring theme was that animals are considered property in virtually all legal systems. And this is not a new categorization. The ancient Greeks considered animals as property. Roman law, Judeo-Christian tradition later reinforced animals as property, and this is carried forward into contemporary legal systems. However, a significant change took place with Darwin. His research introduced the idea that animals are sentient. They experience pain, distress, and even joy. And although the legal meter did not move with Darwin's discoveries, they did sow the seeds for current day analysis. And acknowledging the sentience of animals motivates us to think about these animals differently, especially those animals that share our lives and we don't own solely for economic purposes. The area of law where the concept of sentience really took hold was in animal welfare. Countries began to pass legislation focusing on animal welfare. And what was interesting was that in today's constitutions, I found provisions dealing with animal welfare or the well-being of animals. And this is rather surprising. I wasn't expecting this. And also some European civil codes also started distinguishing animals from things or objects. These are more the exception than the rule. Still, animals are considered property, again, in most legal systems. And at this point in my research, I continued looking for articles, but I also realized that I may be needing to research country by country. So I turned to Brill's Foreign Law Guide because it gave me information about the different legal systems, as well as the heading, the topical heading of animals and animal welfare was very useful. Hein and Line, I used the Animal Studies Library, as well as World Constitutions Illustrated. And two free resources that I found to be very helpful were the Animal Welfare Legislation Database from the Global Animal Law Association and the Animal Legal and Historical Center from Michigan State University. And I'm happy to share the link in the chat later on. So it was in the 20th century, really the later part of the 20th century, that humans started to recognize some animals as a companion rather than a piece of property. This developed in the US and Europe and gradually spread to other parts of the world. And again, animals are property, but there has been some nascent movement towards considering the well-being and welfare of such animals. And I found that there was 3 areas of law where this movement was taking place. And this is where significant human life experiences would affect companion animals and vice versa. And the first one is the tortious injury or death of an animal. And historically, the damages would be limited to fair market value. You get your pet at the shelter, monetary value is low, but that emotional value could be very high. So a few courts have allowed recovery for emotional distress for the death of an animal. There is no common law cause of action for wrongful death of a pet, and courts will defer to the legislatures for an appropriate remedy. So some jurisdictions have considered non-economic or emotional or sentimental value in terms of damages. The second area is divorce. If animals are property, they're just part of the settlement. However, in the US, several states have considered require courts to look at the well-being of an animal during a divorce. as Jenny mentioned in the introduction, Switzerland has been really pretty progressive in this area, and they provide sole ownership of the animal to the party offering the best animal welfare conditions. And although particularly in common law jurisdictions, there has been some suggestion to apply the best interest of the child standard towards pets, courts have pretty much flatly rejected that. And the third area is estate planning and administration. A pet as property cannot inherit property. So when the owner dies, that causes a problem. In the US, most, if not all states have a provision to create a pet trust. In the UK, if a trust is set up to care for a specific animal, then that's called a trust of imperfect obligation. And because the animal as the object of the trust cannot enforce its performance. And Australia the courts take kind of a similar approach. And again, in Switzerland, the civil code requires that the heirs care for an animal if that animal received a bequest. So these are some of the areas where the interaction of human and companion animal. And I also found that the use of an animal will drive how the animal is treated under the law. Many jurisdictions distinguish between a service animal specifically trained to assist a person with a task, such as with impaired vision, versus animals that, such as a companion or emotional support animal, that do not perform any specific tasks under the law. And where I kind of call this under regulatory regimes. For example, in disability rights, in the US, the American Disabilities Act, the regulations define a service animal. In Canada and Japan, I was seeing the term assistance. And in Japan, an assistance animal, or dog specifically, is specifically trained to help a person with a specific physical disability. And those are the kinds of animals that are recognized. And in the EU, it's up to the member states to decide the rights of access for guide or assistance dogs. The other area where there's legal requirements for service, emotional support, or companion animals is, for example, in housing. The US Housing and Urban Development, they consider an emotional or assistance pet's animal to be, is not considered a pet and is allowed to be in housing, whereas a companion animal or pets would not be. So they make these these distinctions. For example, in the Australian state of Victoria, a renter may keep a pet with the landlord's written okay. And in France, as early as 1970, there was national legislation that considered void any residential tenancy that prohibited the keeping of pets. But as you can imagine, with these different distinctions between the types of animals, there were people who would try to pass off their pet or companion animal as a service animal. And to address this, several jurisdictions have put in place service animal misrepresentation or fraud laws. And the next area, which actually comes out of this misrepresentation, is with travel, and particularly with the US with air travel. Up until the late 2020, a passenger was allowed to bring an emotional support animal into the cabin of the plane. And what was happening is people were saying, my pet or my companion animal, that's my emotional support animal. And they felt they could bring that animal of whatever species onto the plane. Well, obviously, there were a lot of complaints. And in late 2020, the regulation was changed. And now only trained service dogs are allowed in the cabin of planes. And this pretty much syncs with what other countries, or how other countries distinguish these animals. In the European Union, pets, particularly dogs, cats, and ferrets, can move non-commercially among member states with a pet passport. And also another area where humans will alter their behavior based on the needs of their companion animal is during disasters. For example, in response to the horrific events and aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the US Congress passed a law requiring states to take into consideration the needs of individuals that had household pets. In the EU, it falls to the member states to come up with an emergency preparedness plan. And through events in Australia and a survey done in some countries in Latin America, it was found that pets will determine how and when a person may evacuate during a disaster. So all these different areas affect this close relationship we have with our companion animals. And finally, there is no international treaty or convention governing companion animals or pets. And so just in conclusion, I really wanted to provide this afternoon an introduction to the areas where the law has begun to take some notice of our special relationship with our companion animals. And as you can see, it varies by jurisdiction, by particular area. And I really see that this is an area of law where it's definitely evolving and changing, and I found it absolutely fascinating. So thank you.
Thanks, Jean, and thank you, Jenny, and also to ASIL and everybody who's attending today. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it? Okay. There we go, slideshow. Okay, so my name is Susan Galtier. I'm with the Penn Carey Law School Biddle Law Library, and today I'm talking about researching the protection of animals in areas of armed conflict. Just to tell you all a little bit about myself and the origins of this project. I am, above all else, an animal lover. I am most particularly drawn to cats, and over the past number of years, I've gotten very involved with cat rescue, first by volunteering through shelters, and later by fostering cats in my home and trapping cats for trap, neuter, and return programs. The first time that I remember becoming acutely aware of the plight of animals in sort of disaster situations was with Hurricane Katrina. As Janine already spoke a little about, I remember watching those events unfold and knowing that the evacuation centers were not accepting companion animals, which resulted in people needing to choose between evacuating themselves and leaving their pets alone at home to face the storm, or refusing to leave New Orleans because they wanted to stay with their animals. And in fact, a lot of people died because they did stay behind with those pets, and a lot of animals were also left behind and displaced, and animal rescuers from all over the country went there to help trap those animals and find their owners or get them into new homes. Since then, I followed many human interest stories. We see them again and again, and particularly in reference to areas of armed conflict. One story that I think we probably all know about, that especially sort of tugged at my heartstrings as a cat lover, was the story of the Cat Man of Aleppo. He was an ambulance driver in Aleppo who stayed behind during the siege of the city to care for stray cats and to accept family pets from people who were evacuating the city. And he promised that he would do everything he could to protect them. The really heartbreaking part of the story that I think often gets glossed over is that that cat sanctuary was bombed, and those cats, for the most part, did die. He fled to Turkey and later moved back to Syria and opened Ernesto's Sanctuary for Cats, which is his current cat sanctuary and veterinary clinic. So having followed that and other stories like this closely, when I saw this call for proposals go out in, I believe, early 2019, I immediately sort of jumped to this idea as a topic, and began to search for the body of law on this topic so that I could make a proposal. I was very quickly faced with the reality, however, that that there was very little academic interest in this topic, especially from a legal perspective. I did find one article by Jerome DeHuntin entitled "The Protection of Animals During Warfare" from 2017 that talked about the silence of international humanitarian law on the topic of animal protection. I, from there, found the Global Animal Law section at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law, found on their website that they were hoping to publish a book on this topic in late 2022. And in fact, that book was recently published. It was published in October, so shortly after our book on research was published. And these few sources gave me enough hope that there would be material to work with, so I did go ahead and submit the proposal. I quickly found out that this was going to be an interdisciplinary topic. Determined pretty quickly that aside from that initial article and a couple of articles about military animals, and most specifically military working dogs, this topic was not going to be approached from a legal perspective. The existing research on animals in armed conflict zones was primarily historical. I also found popular histories and a few individual accounts of soldiers and their working or companion animals. The research was descriptive, but it never remotely approached arguments for legal protections. And in fact, even from a non-legal perspective, very little attention had been paid to this topic before the Vietnam War, when chemical warfare began destroying Vietnamese forests and killing or displacing the local wildlife. It then again came into the spotlight during the Gulf War because of the oil spills, toxic smoke, and just the sheer amount of environmental damage that was happening at that time. It was also the first time that the US military made an effort to keep animals safe during the war and also to alleviate their suffering once the war had ended. And it was the first time that any systematic effort was made to count war-related animal deaths. And this is about the time you also see conservationists enter the chat. So I started seeing articles, both academic and non-academic, that were specifically seeking to link specific aspects of warfare to animal suffering and deaths. So based on all of this research, I was able to break down animals into a couple of categories. The first was animals that are actually being used as military instruments. So this would be your military dogs, military horses, and some other kinds of animals that have at times been used as part of warfare. There was some legal interest here, mostly focusing on reclassifying military animals from equipment or property to actual members of the armed forces so that they could be afforded greater protections, more similar to those afforded to human soldiers. The second and much larger category of animals would be animal civilians. So this might include wildlife populations. Obviously, this is a subject of concern for conservationists and ecologists. Zoo animals, a lot of attention has actually been paid to zoo animals in non-legal scholarship because they suffer much more due to being captive victims. They have nowhere to go. They are not companion animals but cannot necessarily survive on their own in the wild, and they have been subjected to some horrific treatment by humans during wars. And actually, this was the most distressing part of my research, and I won't share those stories here, but they are available if anyone is interested in that topic. The animal civilians also includes livestock and other animals used in agriculture or food production. So these are explicitly considered objects under international humanitarian law, and they're treated as such. And finally, pets and companion animals, which Jean talked about. Interestingly, pets have received the least amount of attention, either legal or non-legal. The coverage of pets in armed conflict zones is generally limited to human interest stories, and often the focus is on the owners or the caretakers rather than on the stories and suffering of the animals themselves. So international law, international humanitarian law, as I mentioned, is largely silent on this topic. It's anthropocentric, human-focused, and it largely ignores the question of protecting animals. No international agreements speak directly to the protection of animals during armed conflict. However, some of the general principles could potentially offer some minimal safeguards, and I have them listed on the next slide. So the Convention Respecting the Laws and Customs of War and its annex contain provisions allowing an occupying power to use occupied property if they don't damage or destroy it. The Convention on the Prohibition of Military or any other hostile use of environmental modification techniques protects the environment during armed conflict by prohibiting the hostile use of the environment itself as a means of warfare. So potentially protecting animals that are a part of those environments from being harnessed and used as a means of warfare. And finally, the additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions relating to the protection of victims of international armed conflicts contains provisions affording extra protection to the environment, including wildlife, and of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, so potentially classes of animals like livestock. We do have a couple of general principles and provisions from other areas of international law that the literature also points out. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES, is one of the only laws to recognize at an international level the importance of protecting animals from harmful human activities. The Convention Concerning the Protection of the World Culture and National Heritage protects precisely delineated areas which constitute the habitat of threatened species of animals and plants of outstanding universal value from the point of view of science or conservation. And finally, any international agreement or customary law that protects the environment during peacetime also remains in force during times of war, including any international agreement protecting the environment or animal life. The literature also calls attention to a couple of proposed laws, which I have included on a slide. This is all also included in my book chapter. So we have the IUCN Draft Convention on the Prohibition of Hostile Military Activities in Protected Areas, which would demilitarize designated internationally protected areas of great environmental importance. We have UDAW, which was a proposed law presented to UNESCO in 1978. It would recognize animals as sentient beings and set forth standards for animal warfare. Needless to say, that did not happen. And we have the ICPA, which is a proposed umbrella treaty that would deal with all aspects of animal issues. And topics covered in the protocols include transportation of animals, methods of taking wildlife, care of exhibited wildlife, and so forth, and could conceivably protect animals in areas of armed conflict should that become law. So as far as the research recommendations that I came away with, again, there was very little out there, but it is definitely a developing topic. I'm seeing more and more interest in it. I know that with the invasion of Ukraine, some more articles have been written on this topic. Many people's attention is on it. We did have the book published in 2022, Animals in the International Law of Armed Conflict. This is the first book that approaches this topic from a legal point of view. And I look forward to reading that cover to cover, and would definitely suggest starting there. I've also included what I would consider to be the essential articles. So the Hampteen article, Protection of Animals During Warfare, which addresses the silence of international humanitarian law. A similar article by Marco Roschini entitled Animals and the Law of Armed Conflict, also from 2017. And additionally, from outside of the law, there is a study by Caitlin Gaynor and her research team from 2016 that specifically links different facets of warfare to different types of animal suffering and death. It's a really rich study that shows, the way use of animals can result in animal deaths, the way destruction of the environment can result in animal death and displacement, and all different really sort of subtopics of what we're talking about here. And I found that to be extremely illuminating as I was thinking about this topic and about potential questions that could come up under this topic. For additional legal resources, I would suggest looking into animal law more generally, armed conflict and international humanitarian law, environmental law. Other areas of international law could potentially include information that could be used to bolster arguments in this area. Non-legal fields of study might include animal studies, history, environmental science, veterinary medicine, military history and studies was a big category, and yielded some sources for me. I would look at the proposed laws on animal protection and welfare. And finally, I just think that as we move forward into the preliminary stages of exploring this topic, that it is going to pretty much come down to primary source analysis. So not a lot of secondary literature out there. I really think it's up to scholars to find these provisions and these customs and whatever else they need to look at and either argue by analogy or use those laws to argue for a more explicit set of agreements that would actually protect animals in areas of armed conflict. So that is pretty much all I have. I will share one last picture of Ernesto's cat sanctuary. They're all waiting for their dinner. It was a tough chapter to write, and I thank you all for listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Susan. Tarek?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jenny, and for ACIL for holding this event. Let me just share my screen. 1 second. Can you see that properly? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Tariq Ahmed, and I'm a foreign law specialist who covers South Asia here at the Law Library. In today's presentation, I'll provide a brief overview of animal law research in India, looking at the constitutional framework for protection of animals, some of the main laws at the center union level, some of the important state level laws, and of course, judicial recognition of legal personality of animals as a recent controversy. And lastly, some of the challenges in researching animal law in India. The constitutional framework for animal protection in India is found in the Constitution of India. In Article 246 and 7th Schedule provide for the lists of legislative subjects under the jurisdiction of Parliament and the state legislatures. There are 3 lists contained in the 7th Schedule. The Union list, where Parliament has exclusive power to make laws. the state list, where state legislatures have exclusive power to make laws, and lastly, the concurrent list, where both parliament and state legislatures have the power to make laws with respect to matters on the list. Now, under the state list, item 14 provides the states have exclusive power to preserve, protect, and improve stock and prevent animal diseases and enforce veterinary training and practice. In the concurrent list, both the central government and the states have power to legislate on prevention of cruelty to animals and the protection of wild animals and birds. Now, there are also two provisions and two other schedules in the Constitution that provides that states may make laws for local governments, panchayat, which are traditional local councils, on animal protection issues. And they can regulate animal husbandry, cattle pounds, prevention of cruelty to animals, and regulation of slaughterhouses and tanneries. The Constitution also establishes a directive principle of state policy under Article 48A, that the state shall endeavor to protect and improve the environment, to safeguard the forests and wildlife of the country. The directive is paired with a constitutional duty, which states that it's a duty of every citizen of India to protect and improve the natural environment, including forests, lakes, rivers, wildlife, and have compassion for all living creatures. Both the above constitutional provisions were introduced in 1976. While they're not directly justiciable or enforceable in Indian courts, as one legal expert, Taruni Kavuri, states of the Animal Legal and Historical Center, they do lay down the groundwork for legislations, policies, and state directives in furtherance of animal protection at the central and state levels of government. As we will see, the courts also rely on fundamental rights, including Article 21, the protection of life for constitutional protection of animals. Here are just a few resources on constitutional framework for animal protection in India. It's a nascent area of law, so there isn't much material, but these are some helpful resources that may be helpful for more introductory research. The resource by Taruni Kavuri is particularly helpful as it kind of breaks down the various constitutional provisions that are applicable in India in terms of animal protection. Here are some of the main central laws that govern the protection of animals in India. The Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act is the main legal framework for animal protection. The main objective of the law is to prevent infliction of unnecessary pain or suffering on animals. And it also establishes statutory bodies such as the Animal Welfare Board of India, and which is mainly mainly advisory functions for animal protection, and the committee for purpose of control and supervision of experiments on animals, which is duty bound to ensure that animals are not subject to unnecessary pain and suffering during and after performance of experiments. The law also contains a number of criminal provisions against cruelty to animals. Section 11 is the main provision, which prohibits beating, kicking, overriding, overdriving, overloading, torturing, or otherwise treating any animals with unnecessary pain or suffering. And of course, specific conduct is also prohibited under Section 11, such as transporting animals in unnecessary pain or suffering and keeping an animal in a cage that does not allow reasonable opportunity for movement. However, this particular law does not apply does exempt scientific experiments, since there's a specific rules issued under the law called the Experiments on Animal Controls and Supervision 1998, which requires experiments to be carried out under stipulated conditions, such as requiring due care and humanity during and before experiments. The Indian Penal Code also has criminal provisions on the protection of animals, such as Section 428 and 429, which provide for the punishment for mischief, for killing, poisoning, maiming, or rendering useless of animals. Finally, India also has a Wildlife Protection Act, which is a comprehensive legal framework that regulates sanctuaries, national parks, zoos, and other protected areas. Its primary aim is to curb the legal trade of endangered species. Here are some resources on national central laws of a general nature, because there aren't a lot that are of a specific focused on researching animal laws. The India Code is the main official repository of central and state laws, but it mostly contains central laws. Legis is a database of acts, which is a service provided by the Supreme Court Judges Library, which provides legislative information for acts when they're passed, when they're granted assent and enforced, and a list of all subsidiary legislation under a law. There are a number of central ministry departments that deal with animal protection that list the relevant central laws that govern animal protection, such as the Ministry of Fisheries, Animal Husbandry, and Dairying. The Animal Welfare Board also provides acts and rules. And of course, the Committee for Purpose of Control and Supervision of Experiments on Animals also provides a listing of acts, rules, and guidelines. And then, of course, there are also some secondary sources like those published in a secondary source by Maneka Gandhi, which kind of lists and outlines most of the central and state laws protecting the animal, which is quite helpful. Now, India is a quasi-federal union comprising 28 states and eight union territories. Each state of India has its own set of laws governing the protection of animals, prevention of cruelty. And some of the states have also adapted changes in national laws through state amendment processes. For example, Tamil Nadu has amended the National Animal Protection Law in response to the Supreme Court, which barred a cultural competition of bull taming. I will discuss this a little bit further in subsequent slides. Many of the states have also prohibited the slaughter of cattle. Some of the communal politics surrounding animal cattle slaughter also tend to revolve around laws that are enacted at the state level. India's legislation on slaughter of cows, buffaloes vary from one state to another. Some states are very strict, where slaughter of cows and its progeny, including bulls and bullocks of all ages, is completely banned. However, some states allow slaughter of cows and bulls under a permit if they're deemed to be injured or otherwise useless. Here are some of the resources regarding state level laws. As you can see, there's not as many. And so you have to kind of rely on the specific ministry websites to get a handle on some of the specific laws. A lot of the ministry websites can be found on the National Portal of India, which kind of lists them. Otherwise, you have to largely rely on secondary sources, secondary printed material, like the one I had earlier spoken of about the kind of lists and outlines many of the central and state level laws. So there's no centralized collection in terms of research for state level laws and animal rules, and it's a particular challenge for researching animal law in India. The current case law on legal personality of animals in India relies on a 2014 decision issued by the Supreme Court in India in the Animal Welfare Board of India versus Nagaraja. The case involved the Jallikattu and the bullock cart races competition that take place in Tamil Nadu. The competition involves releasing a bull in a crowd where multiple participants attempt to tame and pacify the bull. The court held that the competition violated the provisions of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. The court also extended to animals under Article 21, the right to life, recognizing that animals have the right to live with honor and dignity, which cannot be arbitrarily deprived and must be protected, and animals must be protected from unlawful attacks. However, the court didn't explicitly extend legal personality to animals. As one animal law expert, Rajesh Reddy, notes, although India's Supreme Court did not employ the explicit language of legal personhood in Nagaraja, its opinion did so implicitly and provided the foundation of two of India's highest state courts to emphasize the inherent connection between rights and personhood. The two court decisions that he's referring to, the first one is in 2018. The Uttarakhand High Court in Narayan Dutt Bhatt is a decision relates to the interstate transporting of horses between Nepal and India, and the overloading of horses in violation of the Prevention of Cruelty of Animals Act and its subsidiary rules. It relied on the earlier Nagaraja decision and held that just as corporations, rivers, scriptures, and even Hindu idols have been recognized as legal persons by the judiciary, the entire animal kingdom, including avian and aquatic, are declared as legal entities having a distinct persona with corresponding rights, duties, and liabilities. All the citizens throughout the state of Uttarakhand, the court states, are hereby declared persons in loco parentis, akin to parental relationship, as a human face for the welfare protection of animals. Similarly, in a subsequent decision on Karnal Singh, the court declares all animals in the animal kingdom, including avian and aquatic species, as legal entities, persons with corresponding rights, duties, and liabilities. However, in 2020, in a public interest litigation, the Supreme Court has pushed back on this reasoning, and it is reported to have stated, as the decision is not final, has not been published, that animals already have the protection of law, but by making them a legal entity is giving them the capacity to sue and be sued. How is that possible? Very unlikely that we will entertain the prayer for declaring them as legal entity. Just to give you guys a sense of the competition that the Supreme Court case covered, I'm just gonna play this for just a couple of seconds. Do you guys get a sense of the cultural competition that it mostly takes place in Tamil Nadu? Okay. Oops, sorry. Here are just some important general resources for case law in India. Though there are private articles and private publications that compile important landmark case law and animal law research, there isn't a reputable legal research resource that I could find that compiles animal law case law in India. So here are just some of the general resources that I relied on, and some of the case law, some of the important resources that are found online, and that are private databases that can be relied upon and can be used for animal law research. The Supreme Court of India, of course, has a website that provides general judgments, and it can be searched by topic, but sometimes the results aren't very helpful. So, there's also a database of case laws as well. Just like as there was a database of laws, the Supreme Court Judges Library also provides a service on that as well. And then, of course, in terms of private databases, SCC Online is one of the most reputable databases for case law online, and it's oftentimes relied upon by the courts as well, and it's a helpful resource for researching case law. Thank you. That brings my presentation to an end.
Thank you, Tariq.
Yeah.
Shay?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My presentation is going to be, as the chapter that I wrote for the related book is, on marine mammal protection in the United States. So why marine mammals as a group? Well, for one reason, the US has a statute that specifically covers all marine mammals, but they also face similar threats like commercial fishing bycatch, vessel strikes, being hit by vessels, and underwater noise pollution. In this presentation, like the chapter that I wrote, I'll focus on the research, what there is to be found and where to find it. I'm not an expert in this area of law, so if you have really specific questions about it, I might have to say, I don't know, but here's how I'd research that. I'll start out with some background on the various legal requirements and close with some research tips. This presentation is also largely focused on national law, as the chapter was, but I'll highlight a couple of international implications. So, the Marine Mammal Protection Act is the major U.S. statute in this area. It was passed in 1972. For context, a lot of other environmental and wildlife protection laws were also being passed around this time, from the 60s through the 80s or so. The Endangered Species Act was passed the following year, the Clean Water Act the same year. It covers marine mammals, and it has this technical statutory definition for them: mammals morphologically adapted to the marine environment, or that primarily inhabit the marine environment, and any parts of those animals. So that actually describes whales, porpoises, and dolphins. Those are the cetaceans, seals and sea lions, or pinnipeds, manatees and dugongs. Those are the order Sirenia mentioned in the statute, and polar bears, walruses, and sea and marine otters. And that's a southern sea otter, being cute on the slide. This act prohibits taking marine mammals. That's its central provision. Take has a really broad statutory definition. It doesn't just include killing the animal or literally taking it. It includes hunting or harassing the animal in addition to capturing or killing it, or attempting to do any of those things. And this prohibition applies within the United States and also to people or vessels under U.S. jurisdiction on the high seas. It does include some exceptions. So, for example, takings by Alaska Natives for subsistence or for craft and sale of native handicrafts, takings in self-defense or for the defense of others. There's a Good Samaritan exception, so you can take a marine mammal to prevent its injury or death. One example might be untangling it from fishing net. And incidental takings by U.S. citizens employed on foreign fishing vessels are also accepted, and takings resulting from actions necessary for national defense. Permits can also be issued for certain takings. The term for a lot of these is incidental takes, that is unintentional, and it's probably what most of these permits are for. A permit might be granted for taking in the course of commercial fishing, say, only if the taking will have, one, a negligible impact on the marine mammal species or population stock, and also it protects subsistence use. The taking permitted cannot have an unmitigable adverse impact on Alaska Native subsistence uses. The requirements and process for incidental take permits for commercial fishing have been a big point of conflict and the subject of a lot of the amendments to the Act. A lot of incidental take permits are also for things that make noise underwater, like military exercises or oil and gas exploration, which might be considered to harass the marine mammals. A few kinds of intentional takes can also be permitted. One good example of these are takes for scientific research, but the default rule is no taking marine mammals, and then there are these exceptions and potential permits. The Act isn't just about taking individual animals, though. Agencies can also designate particular species or population stocks, segments of a species that are sort of a unit, as depleted, which triggers some additional protections. Other people and organizations can also petition the agencies to review the status of the species, and the agency must act on those. So it's not just up to them to decide if something is depleted. Well, it is, but someone can make sure they address it. If a species or population stock is found to be depleted, no permits for takes can be issued at all, and the responsible agency must prepare and implement a plan to restore the species or population stock. So it's got those protective provisions and also these provisions for restoring depleted stocks. Which agencies are responsible? Well, it depends on the species. Jurisdiction is split between the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries. NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, with each having responsibility for certain marine mammal species. The Fish and Wildlife Service gets sea and marine otters, walruses, polar bears, manatees, and dugongs. NOAA Fisheries is responsible for seals, sea lions, whales, dolphins, and porpoises. I think this split is roughly sort of animals, marine mammals that are more or less land associated and marine mammals that are completely ocean living, but I'm not quite sure. I don't think that manatees live on land at all. So that's just how the species have been split. These agencies are responsible for issuing permits, enforcing the Act, management of species and population stocks, entering into co-management agreements with Indian tribes. And a third relevant agency, which doesn't actually implement the Act with respect to any species, but is responsible for oversight, is the Marine Mammal Commission. And they provide oversight and coordinate between agencies, provide advice. It's been amended multiple times. I'm not going to read all of these out, but a lot of the major amendments relate to requirements for incidental takes by commercial fisheries. That's been a real flashpoint for both the fisheries and environmental groups. Some of these are specifically focused on dolphins caught in the course of tuna fishing. Dolphins are marine mammals, and the sort of dolphin-safe tuna issue has been something the Marine Mammal Protection Act has been amended to address. A couple of amendments to highlight here. One in 1984 restricted foreign fishing vessels' access to U.S. tuna markets if they weren't subject to incidental take regulations similar to those of the US. And this sparked a GATT dispute with Mexico. Another one passed in 1997 lifted that tuna embargo for some countries, and it was the result of international negotiation resulting in a international dolphin protection plan that if a tuna exporting country was complying with it, the US would accept their tuna. This isn't the only law in this area. The Marine Mammal Protection Act isn't the only one you might have to research. The Endangered Species Act is probably the other most significant one here. It also prohibits the taking and importation of species listed as endangered, subject to some exceptions. NOAA Fisheries and the Fish and Wildlife Service are again the responsible agencies here. And in addition to prohibiting the taking, the agencies may provide additional protections for threatened species through regulation. They must also designate critical habitat, portion of a species' habitat that are essential to the conservation of the species. This designation limits federal agency actions and federally funded or permitted activities, which must avoid the destruction or adverse modification of critical habitat. There are also some species-specific laws, for example, this one protecting fur seals, and some broader laws like the Animal Welfare Act. And states and tribes also have their own laws that you may have to research. The Marine Mammal Protection Act does preempt state law that relates to the taking of marine mammals, but there are still plenty of state laws that apply. Some states have their own Endangered Species Act. There are some statutes requiring the states to consider impacts to marine mammals in certain planning processes. The manatee, in fact, is the state marine mammal of Florida, and there is a state statute declaring the entire state of Florida to be a manatee sanctuary. Marine mammals are also central to the physical and cultural subsistence of many indigenous peoples, so it's not surprising that many coastal tribes have also passed laws protecting them. For example, the Sitka tribe of Alaska has an ordinance governing the take of marine mammals that explicitly incorporates tribal customs and traditions into its provisions. So that's a quick overview of the law. How can you research to find out more? One, secondary sources, of course. I was a little surprised when I researched not to find more writing focusing on marine mammals. There's a lot of scholarly writing, journal articles focusing on some aspect of marine mammal protection, but reference works, treatises, and the like are sparser. You're more likely to find a chapter on marine mammals in a broader work on environmental law or wildlife law. A couple of recommendations for this audience in particular are these two books listed here, the Nicholas Selheim book and the Cameron Jeffries book, which deal with marine mammals specifically in the international context. There's also plenty of writing on the Endangered Species Act. There's a lot of reference works here. One particularly, I think, good sort of just practical reference work is this Endangered Species Act Law, Policy, and Perspectives, published by the ABA's section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. For researching statutes and regulations, the Marine Mammal Protection Act is helpfully codified all in one place. It's not one of those acts that's scattered across the United States Code. And the Marine Mammal Commission also has a nice consolidated version on their website. When you're looking for regulations, remember that there are two agencies responsible for the act, the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA Fisheries, and their regulations are found in two different places because they're two different agencies in the Code of Federal Regulations. NOAA Fisheries regulations are a lot more detailed than the Fish and Wildlife Service. I see we're nearing time, so I'm going to sort of cut out some of the detail in my last couple of slides here. But I did want to note that there's a lot of sub-regulatory activity happening in this area: permits, conservation plans, other population management and conservation activities, oversights. The agency's websites are tremendously helpful in researching these activities, and notices of some are also published in the Federal Register. In particular, with respect to oversight, the Marine Mammal Commission actually has a tremendous amount of oversight information on their website, as well as general information on the Act. I'll close by mentioning tribal laws, which can be particularly difficult to research. Often what you'll find will be out of date, or you won't find anything at all. One excellent resource for researchers of tribal law is the National Indian Law Library. The library maintains the most comprehensive collection of tribal codes and constitutions, and much of their collection is available and searchable online. They also have an excellent guide to researching tribal law written by their former director, David Selden, which is linked on their website. Westlaw and Lexis have a little bit in this area. Westlaw has more on tribal codes and constitutions, while Lexis is better in tribal court coverage, but neither are particularly thorough. Tribe websites are also worth checking, but access there can be spotty. If any of you were at the most recent conference of the International Association of Law Libraries, you may have heard a really interesting talk about the obstacles tribes face in publishing their laws. And that's all my time. Hopefully I'm leaving you with a general idea of the applicable laws, mainly the Marine Mammal Protection Act, but also some others, as well as some advice for researching others. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, Shay, and thank you everyone else. That was very interesting. I mean, I wish we had more time to discuss all these topics. And I guess you can see from the presentations that we just heard that it's really a cross-cutting issue. So, I mean, animals are really issues about the animal protection, animal rights is addressed in every area of the law. So I would also like to note that we'll make the slides available to participants of the webinar. So you can, if you want to research these topics further, you can look at the slides and dig a little deeper. And yeah, if there are any questions, I guess we might be able to answer one or more, even though it's already 3 o'clock. But if there are any questions, then you please let us know. And let's see. I guess there's the question for Tarek specifically. Do you think that the India laws are important for tiger conservation? You're muted.
They're probably very important, but I'm not sure how effective they are in terms of conservation and thing. This is a legal issue that I haven't really looked into in particular, but I'm happy to look into. The Library of Congress, Law Library of Congress has a service of Ask a Librarian. So if you have any specific questions, you can happy to send them, and I'm happy to look into it. I'm not an expert in animal law, but I can try my best in terms of trying to figure out how effective and how important the specific law is in terms of tiger conservation.
Thank you, Tarek. I guess in question for everyone that we might still be able to answer, what do you think are currently the cutting edge issues on animal law right now? I guess we've already mentioned, for example, Susan was talking about animals in armed conflict, but particularly is a issue that's on everyone's mind right now because of Ukraine. Animal standing, I guess, in a lot of countries, we saw would be one of the topics that's really up to date. Any other, would any of you like to chime in?
My first thought was similar to you, animal as legal entities, as Tarek was talking about, and standing. Although this is purely from a layperson perspective, but that's the first thing that came to mind.
I have another question for Tarek. There was an article from the ABA on development since the Kaban decision in Pakistan. I don't know if you're familiar with that decision, Tarek. But apparently 2 jurisdictions have given constitutional rights and standing to animals in Pakistan. So similar to India. But the issue is still open in the Supreme Court. And the question is this being followed in other jurisdictions? Have you heard anything about that?
So yeah, I think the issue is kind of similar in terms of how it's happening in India and how it's happening in Pakistan. When specific high courts give a decision, it doesn't necessarily have national precedents. Similarly, even though 2 high courts in India have given a decision recognizing the legal personality of animals. Interestingly enough, there are 2 different courts, but it's the same judge at different times. So it's the same judge who gave a very similar decision in terms of high court. But as I had mentioned, the Supreme Court is now kind of pushing back on that reasoning, saying that can we really give standing to animals? Can they really sue? And then they specifically mentioned, even though their decision is not final, they have said that this is not something that we will consider. So I'm expecting maybe it might go similarly in Pakistan as well, but I'm happy to look into it as well further to get a sense. But this might get a general sense of how the trend of the case law is, that the high courts are take a very kind of activist stance, while maybe the Supreme Court might take a more conservative stance. India is likely to take a conservative stance.
Maybe you can take one last question. There was a question for Susan. That I noticed that research animals were not one of your categories, but I imagine they may experience neglect during times of conflicts. Any thoughts on that?
That's a really good question. And I didn't actually come across even one resource that I recall discussing research animals. I would imagine that their case would be similar to sort of the captive victim scenario with the zoo animals. The questions being, whether they get left behind, whether they get released to sort of fend for themselves, what happens when, occupying forces find them, what will they do to them? But I cannot cite any specific resources on that topic, unfortunately. I do think that it's probably an area that's ripe for additional research.
Thank you. And I think we're already 5 minutes over, so I guess that concludes our webinar. I would like to thank ACIL and all the speakers today and everyone who attended our webinar. And I hope, you learned something. And like I said, we'll share the slides, and the recording will be made available on the ACIL website as well. So thank you so much.